It is the sort of thing that went on in the Soviet Union.
Was he really a threat, or was the company out to silence him?
Absolutely not.
Chief Investigative Correspondent Brian Ross with one man's frightening ordeal. What was really behind the whispers at work? Ordeal, all because his boss made one phone call. The man was handcuffed, drugged, locked up in a mental ward against his will. And why? He says simply because he spoke up at work. Chief Investigative Correspondent Brian Ross has a frightening story for any worker.
In the small rural county in South Carolina, where his family has lived since the Revolutionary War, Gary McClain has driven the same road to the same job to the same factory for some 17 years, until one day last summer.
I was going through New Ellington on Highway 19.
The day Gary McClain became labeled an imminent threat, a possible workplace time bomb.
It was at least 6 patrol cars stopped me right in the middle of the road, yelling, "Turn off your truck, get out of the truck, keep your hands where we can see them."
It was the beginning of a trip into a dark world filled with innuendo, fear, and the power of a big corporation.
The officers was coming from this direction, from that direction, from my side and behind.
With guns?
With guns drawn, aimed at me.
In the course of less than an hour, 45-year-old Gary McClain, a man with no criminal record, no record of violence on the job, would be handcuffed, detained, refused a lawyer, drugged, and involuntarily committed as mentally ill.
It was like a nightmare. I mean, but it was really happening to me.
McClain is a church-going man, well-read and thoughtful. Unmarried, he says the only mental health problems he ever had involved counseling for depression and a few visits a year to a local psychiatrist, something millions of Americans do.
And I went over there voluntarily because I was having trouble with some depression.
But his confidential mental health record would later be distorted and used against him. McClain worked for the huge oil products conglomerate Tenneco, at Tenneco's plastic packaging plant in Beach Island, South Carolina, which produces plastic food trays and hefty plastic plates, a Tenneco brand name.
The plant employs a little over 240 employees.
It was plant manager Joe Garrison who, along with Tenneco corporate executives, made the decision to call the sheriff based on what Garrison says were complaints from other workers.
Members of my staff relayed concerns and fears from employees that talked to them.
Yet in the course of an hour-long interview with 2020, Garrison was unable to cite a single concrete threat or statement made by McClain, referring only to the vague hearsay complaints from employees and managers whose names and positions Garrison refused to provide.
There are at least 20.
At least 20. Do you have a list somewhere?
No, I don't.
And 20 people all said they were afraid of Gary McClain.
They didn't. Some said they were specifically afraid, but some said they were concerned.
What were they afraid of?
What they were afraid of, working, of coming to work.
But it turns out the great fear of Gary McClain began around the same time he became known at the plant for trying to organize a union, he says, to protect older, higher-paid workers like himself, wearing a red cap from the operating engineers of the AFL-CIO.
I believe in standing up for what I believe in.
So you became very public about it?
Yeah, I became very vocal about it, too.
It was July 28th last year when McClain, in front of everyone in his shift, challenged plant manager Joe Garrison over the union.
The union you opposed?
A union I opposed. Yes, Gary raised his voice.
He interrupted you?
He interrupted me.
I asked him point blank. I said, "Why don't you let a union representative come in here and speak to all the crews?" And he said, "We have enough of those in here already." And he said, "Dismiss."
You were on a collision course?
Oh yes, I was marked.
Did you have a gun?
No, I didn't have any weapons.
It was the very next day that Tenneco contacted the Aiken County Sheriff, which used a SWAT team, the K-9 team, and the sheriff himself to take Gary McClain into custody as he drove to work, unarmed.
They put me in handcuffs. They walked me to a patrol car. While I was sitting in the patrol car, this officer came over to air on the radio saying, "We got that Tenneco package."
We got that Tenneco package?
Yeah, he said that Tenneco package.
Referring to you, you think?
Right, I was the Tenneco package.
What they told us was that this individual had frightened them and frightened co-workers.
Aiken County Sheriff Howard Sellers says it was the kind of report from a major company that he couldn't ignore, particularly since the Aiken County area has twice in the last 5 years been the scene of workplace violence, with 6 people killed, something Tenneco says was very much on the minds of its employees.
They were saying things like, I don't want to sit next to a member of management in case Gary comes in and I'm in the line of fire.
But you have his personnel file available to you.
There is a personnel file for Mr. McClain.
In that file, is there any incident in the last 2 or 3 years that would suggest he is this dangerous person?
There's nothing in his file that I'm aware of that would suggest that.
You know there have been many cases where disgruntled employees at big companies, small companies...
I know that, and that's what Tenneco's playing on. They're building up everybody's fears, you know, trying to make them think that I'm a dangerous person, and I'm not. I never threatened anybody out there.
Unlike Gary McClain, the alleged killers in the 2 shootings around Aiken County had records of specific threats and violence.
We acted on, I think, responsibly with the information we had at the time.
Did they tell you that he was active in trying to organize a union?
No, they did not.
I didn't tell, or the company didn't make the sheriff aware that this was a union supporter, and that's why...
You withheld that information from him?
It's not that we withheld him, it wasn't germane to our concerns.
Do you wish they had told you that?
I think it would have been very helpful.
As a legal justification to stop McClain, the sheriff used an unserved 4-year-old arrest warrant that grew out of a feud with a neighbor. McClain, an avid outdoorsman, had fired his hunting rifle in the back of his property.
And I had a bullet in the chamber. It would not come out, so I fired it because I didn't want to leave a live round in my chamber. And you'll have a loaded gun in the house like that.
At the time, 1995, deputies ruled the complaint unfounded, and the warrant the neighbors swore out sat ignored among thousands of such minor warrants in a bureaucratic backlog until Tenneco called.
As a practical matter, it wasn't really a high priority,
No,
though, was it?
It was a very low priority.
In fact, the warrant wasn't even served when McClain was stopped. Instead of taking him to the county jail, the armed deputies delivered a handcuffed McClain to the county hospital for a mental evaluation.
He appeared to be confused. He appeared to be agitated.
Wouldn't you be if you were stopped by your own SWAT team?
Yes, sir, and we chose to take the route of having him evaluated to see if there was anything to this mental health allegation against him.
Based on hospital records, Tenneco's vague, unverified description of McClain as a threat appears to have been simply passed on by sheriff's deputies to the emergency room doctor, and apparently accepted as evidence enough that McClain was mentally ill and posed a substantial risk to himself and others.
They told me they was wanting me to take a shot. I don't know what kind of medication it was. And I told them, no, I'm not taking it. So then the nurse called in the 2 deputies to hold me, and they gave me the shot.
Under an emergency provision in South Carolina law, McClain was then taken by sheriff's deputies to a mental hospital where he would spend 2 weeks detained and drugged against his will before a judge finally released him.
Do you think you'd ever get out of there?
At the time, I didn't know if I was going to get out. I said, I haven't done anything to be here. You know, I'd speak up. But see, they looked at that as being mentally ill.
More evidence
Right.
that you were mentally ill.
Because the more I denounced it, the more that convinced them is, oh, this man's sick, he's delusional.
The hospital records tell the nightmare. Patient denies allegations. Patient has an angry affect. Patient refuses medication.
Here I was, you know, telling the truth, and nobody believed me. And I cried.
A psychiatrist appointed by the judge to evaluate McClain has now said McClain is not in need of any further treatment, and McClain is suing Tenneco and the sheriff for what he claims is a violation of his civil rights, a case gaining great attention in the American labor movement.
This is, you know, over the top. I've never seen a company before literally get the local authorities to conspire to put an employee in a mental institution for doing this.
We asked Georgetown University law professor Michael Gottesman, who's handled numerous union cases before the Supreme Court, including that of nuclear worker Karen Silkwood, to look at this case, which he called a new low in anti-union tactics.
It's diabolically clever because it accomplishes all the purposes that firing the employee would do, but it accomplishes even more. If we put him away in a mental institution, we've really shut him up. Who's going to step up and say, okay, I'm next? Since Gary is no longer here, I'm the one who's going to stand up and argue for why we should have a union.
In fact, the union says its efforts to organize at the Tenneco plant have been stopped dead.
You're in the roadway, please.
We weren't allowed on the plant property, and with security guards watching, most workers wouldn't stop to talk. One who did said McClain was a bit of a loner, but no threat to anyone.
Was he threatening people because of the union, or?
No.
No?
They might have took it as a threat because of the way he is. Because he is a pretty lone, quiet person to himself.
You think he's insane?
No.
There are some Tenneco plants around the country which are unionized. And since the case became public, Tenneco has maintained that what happened to Gary McClain had nothing to do with the union and was the sole responsibility of the sheriff's office.
We gave them no encouragement, no suggestions. We just made them aware of a situation that was going on in our plant.
You had nothing to do with him being locked up as mentally ill?
Absolutely not.
You really believe that?
I certainly believe that. I know
and you're
what I did.
saying that the position he had as a union organizer had nothing to do with it?
It had nothing to do with it.
But that's very much called into question by what a top Tenneco executive allegedly said when he contacted Gary McClain's personal psychiatrist in Aiken, South Carolina, using McClain's personnel records to do so. In a memo written the same day McClain was picked up, the psychiatrist says Tenneco's director of occupational health, a Dr. Burley, contacted him and described McClain as very much involved in drumming up support for the union and displaying paranoid thinking and behaviors.
Had Dr. Burley ever met Gary McClain?
I don't believe that Dr. Burley ever met Mr. McClain.
Did he ever examine him?
If he didn't meet him, I don't think he could have examined him.
Nevertheless, according to the memo, the Tenneco doctor, Dr. Burley, from his office in New York, said he believed Mr. McClain suffered from a mental illness, appeared to be dangerous, and Dr. Burley said he would be passing on his views to the sheriff to initiate an involuntary commitment. Tenneco would not permit Dr. Burley to talk with 2020.
It is the sort of thing that went on in the Soviet Union, except that the Soviets did it with a bit more due process.
Law professor Greg Block, also a psychiatrist, says the memo clearly shows that Tenneco was concerned about the union and raises serious questions about how big companies like Tenneco try to pry into employee health records.
If you see a psychiatrist, if you just have something embarrassing that's physically wrong with you that you wouldn't want your employer and the world potentially to know, you don't have protection. That's what 160 million Americans who get their health insurance through the workplace need to be worried about.
At the request of the sheriff, the FBI has now been asked to investigate the case of Gary McClain, who hasn't worked a day since he was declared mentally ill.
To be done that way, and you know there's not anything wrong with you, and for somebody to treat you like you're just some sicko, it hurts.
Brian, Gary McClain is in his 40s and has years ahead in which to work. Is he employable?
Well, it's the kind of accusation that once made leaves a stigma very hard, if not impossible, to remove. And Gary wonders how he'll ever explain it to a future boss.
So how do things stand now?
Well, Tenneco is paying him, but they won't let him on the property, and they won't give him his job back unless he sees a psychiatrist they appoint. Meantime, he's appealing to the National Labor Relations Board, and a ruling could come very shortly.
And if the ruling is in his favor, then they have to hire him back.
That's exactly right.
Even though it might not be a very pleasant place for him to
That's what he fears. Very tough situation for Gary.
Tough situation all around. Thank you, Brian. I do want to tell our viewers that you and Dr. Greg Block, who is one of the experts in Brian's report, are going to be available to chat online with anyone who has questions right after this program?
That's right after the show at 11 o'clock Eastern Time on abcnews.com.
Thank you, Brian.